Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville, as read by Jim Kelly. Volume 2, First Book, Chapter 5, How Religion in the United States Avails Itself of Democratic Tendencies. I have shown in a preceding chapter that men cannot do without dogmatic belief, and even that it is much to be desired that such belief should exist among them. I now add that, of all the kinds of dogmatic belief, the most desirable appears to me to be dogmatic belief in matters of religion, and this is a clear inference, even from no higher consideration than the interests of this world. There is hardly any human action, however particular it may be, that does not originate in some very general idea men have conceived of the deity, of his relation to mankind, of the nature of their own souls, and of their duties to their fellow creatures. Nor can anything prevent these ideas from being the common spring from which all the rest emanates. Men are therefore immeasurably interested in acquiring fixed ideas of God, of the soul, and of their general duties to their Creator and their fellow men. For doubt on these first principles would abandon all their actions to chance, and would condemn them in some way to disorder and impotence. This, then, is the subject on which it is most important for each of us to have fixed ideas, and, unhappily, it is also the subject on which it is most difficult for each of us, left to himself, to settle his opinions by the sole force of his reason. None but minds singularly free from the ordinary cares of life, minds at once penetrating, subtle, and trained by thinking, can, even with much time and care, sound the depths of these truths that are so necessary. And indeed, we see that philosophers are themselves almost always surrounded with uncertainties, that at every step the natural light which illuminates their path grows dimmer and less secure, and that, in spite of all their efforts, they have discovered as yet only a few conflicting notions on which the mind of man has been tossed about for thousands of years without ever firmly grasping the truth or finding novelty even in its errors. Studies of this nature are far above the average capacity of men, and even if the majority of mankind were capable of such pursuits, it is evident that leisure to cultivate them would still be wanting. Fixed ideas about God and human nature are indispensable to the daily practice of men's lives, but the practice of their lives prevents them from acquiring such ideas. The difficulty appears to be without a parallel. Among the sciences, there are some that are useful to the mass of mankind and are within its reach. Others can be approached only by the few and are not cultivated by the many, who require nothing beyond their more remote applications. But the daily practice of the science I speak of is indispensable to all, although the study of it is inaccessible to the greater number. General ideas respecting God and human nature are therefore the ideas above all others which it is most suitable to withdraw from the habitual action of private judgment, and in which there is most to gain and least to lose by recognizing a principle of authority. The first object, and one of the principal advantages of religion, is to furnish to each of these fundamental questions a solution that is at once clear, precise, intelligible, and lasting to the mass of mankind. There are religions that are false and very absurd, but it may be affirmed that any religion which remains within the circle I have just traced without pretending to go beyond it, as many religions have attempted to do for the purpose of restraining on every side the free movement of the human mind, imposes a salutary restraint on the intellect, and it must be admitted that, if it does not save men in another world, it is at least very conducive to their happiness and their greatness in this. This is especially true of men living in free countries. When the religion of a people is destroyed, doubt gets hold of the higher powers of the intellect and half paralyzes all the others. Every man accustoms himself to having only confused and changing notions on the subjects most interesting to his fellow creatures and himself. His opinions are ill-defended and easily abandoned, and in despair of ever solving by himself the hard problems respecting the destiny of man, he ignobly submits to think no more about them. Such a condition cannot but enervate the soul, relax the springs of will, and prepare a people for servitude. Not only does it happen in such a case that they allow their freedom to be taken from them, they frequently surrender it themselves. When there is no longer any principle of authority in religion, any more than in politics, men are speedily frightened at the aspect of this unbounded independence. The constant agitation of all surrounding things alarms and exhausts them. As everything is at sea in the sphere of the mind, they determine at least that the mechanism of society shall be firm and fixed. As they cannot resume their ancient belief, they assume a master. For my part, I doubt whether man can ever support at the same time complete religious independence and entire political freedom. And I am inclined to think that if faith be wanting in him, he must be subject, and if he be free, he must believe. Perhaps, however, this great utility of religions is still more obvious among nations where equality of conditions prevails than among others. It must be acknowledged that equality, which brings great benefits into the world, nevertheless suggests to men, as will be shown hereafter, some various dangerous propensities. It tends to isolate them from one another, to concentrate every man's attention upon himself, and it lays open the soul to an inordinate love of material gratification. The greatest advantage of religion is to inspire diametrically contrary principles. There is no religion that does not place the object of man's desires above and beyond the treasures of earth, and that does not naturally raise his soul to regions far above those of the senses. Nor is there any which does not impose on man some duties towards his kind, and thus draw him at times from the contemplation of himself. This is found in the most false and dangerous religions. Religious nations are therefore naturally strong in the very point on which democratic nations are weak. This shows of what importance it is for men to preserve their religion as their conditions become more equal. I have neither the right nor the intention of examining the supernatural means that God employs to infuse religious belief in the heart of man. I am at this moment considering religions in a purely human point of view. My object is to inquire by what means they may most easily retain their sway in the democratic ages upon which we are entering. It has been shown that at times of general culture and equality, the human mind consents only with reluctance to adopt dogmatic opinions and feels their necessity acutely only in spiritual matters. This proves in the first place that at such times religions ought more cautiously than at any other to confine themselves within their own precincts, for in seeking to extend their power beyond religious matters, they incur a risk of not being believed at all. The circle within which they seek to restrict the human intellect ought therefore to be carefully traced, and beyond its verge the mind should be left entirely free to its own guidance. Mohammed professed to derive from heaven, and has inserted in the Quran not only religious doctrines, but political maxims, civil and criminal laws, and theories of science. The Gospel, on the contrary, speaks only of the general relations of men to God and to each other, beyond which it inculcates and imposes no point of faith. This alone, besides 1,000 other reasons, would suffice to prove that the former of these religions will no longer predominate in a cultivated and democratic age, while the latter is destined to retain its sway at these as at all other periods. In continuation of the same inquiry, I find that for religions to maintain their authority, humanly speaking, in democratic ages, not only must they confine themselves strictly within the circle of spiritual matters, but their power also will depend very much on the nature of the belief they inculcate, on the external forms they assume, and on the obligations they impose. The preceding observation, that equality leads men to very general and very vast ideas, is principally to be understood in respect to religion. Men who are similar and equal in the world readily conceive the idea of the one God, governing every man by the same laws, and granting to every man future happiness on the same conditions. The idea of the unity of mankind constantly leads them back to the idea of the unity of the Creator, while on the contrary, in a state of society where men are broken up into very unequal ranks, they are apt to devise as many deities as there are nations, castes, classes, or families, and to trace 1,000 private roads to heaven. It cannot be denied that Christianity itself has felt, to some extent, the influence that social and political conditions exercise on religious opinions. When the Christian religion first appeared upon earth, Providence, by whom the world was doubtless prepared for its coming, had gathered a large portion of the human race, like an immense flock, under the scepter of the Caesars. The men of whom this multitude was composed were distinguished by numerous differences, but they had this much in common, that they all obeyed the same laws, and that every subject was so weak and insignificant in respect to the emperor that all appeared equal when their condition was contrasted with his. This novel and peculiar state of mankind necessarily predisposed men to listen to the general truths that Christianity teaches, and may serve to explain the facility and rapidity with which they penetrated into the human mind. The counterpart of this state of things was exhibited after the destruction of the empire. The Roman world being then, as it were, shattered into 1,000 fragments, each nation resumed its former individuality. A scale of ranks grew up in the bosom of these nations. The different races were more sharply defined, and each nation was divided by castes into several peoples. In the midst of this common effort, which seemed to be dividing human society into as many fragments as possible, Christianity did not lose sight of the leading general ideas that it had brought into the world, but it appeared, nevertheless, to lend itself as much as possible to the new tendencies created by this distribution of mankind into fractions. Men continued to worship one God, the Creator and Preserver of all things. But every people, every city, and so to speak, every man, thought to obtain some distinct privilege and win the favor of an especial protector near the throne of grace. Unable to subdivide the deity, they multiplied and unduly enhanced the importance of his agents. The homage due to saints and angels became an almost idolatrous worship for most Christians, and it might be feared for a moment that the religion of Christ would retrograde towards the superstitions which it had overcome. It seems evident that the more the barriers are removed which separate one nation from another and one citizen from another, the stronger is the bent of the human mind, as if by its own impulse, towards the idea of a single and all-powerful being, dispensing equal laws in the same manner to every man. In democratic ages, then, it is particularly important not to allow the homage paid to secondary agents to be confused with the worship due to the Creator alone. Another truth is no less clear, that religions ought to have fewer external observances in democratic periods than at any other. In speaking of philosophical method among the Americans, I have shown that nothing is more repugnant to the human mind in an age of equality than the idea of subjection to forms. Men living at such times are impatient of figures. To their eyes, symbols appear to be puerile artifices used to conceal or to set off truths that should be more naturally bared to the light of day. They are unmoved by ceremonial observances and are disposed to attach only a secondary importance to the details of public worship. Those who have to regulate the external forms of religion in a democratic age should pay a close attention to these natural propensities of the human mind in order not to run counter to them unnecessarily. I firmly believe in the necessity of forms, which fix the human mind in the contemplation of abstract truths, and aid it in embracing them warmly and holding them with firmness. Nor do I suppose that it is possible to maintain a religion without external observances, but, on the other hand, I am persuaded that in the ages upon which we are entering, it would be peculiarly dangerous to multiply them beyond measure, and that they ought rather to be limited to as much as is absolutely necessary to perpetuate the doctrine itself, which is the substance of religion, of which the ritual is only the form. A religion which became more insistent in details, more inflexible, and more burdened with small observances during the time that men became more equal, would soon find itself limited to a band of fanatic zealots in the midst of a skeptical multitude. I anticipate the objection that, as all religions have general and eternal truths for their object, they cannot thus shape themselves to the shifting inclinations of every age without forfeiting their claim to certainty in the eyes of mankind. To this I reply again that the principal opinions which constitute a creed, and which theologians call articles of faith, must be carefully distinguished from the accessories connected with them. Religions are obliged to hold fast to the former, whatever be the peculiar spirit of the age, but they should take good care not to bind themselves in the same manner to the latter at a time when everything is in transition, and when the mind, accustomed to the moving pageant of human affairs, reluctantly allows itself to be fixed on any point. The permanence of external and secondary things seems to me to have a chance of enduring only when civil society is itself static. Under any other circumstances, I am inclined to regard it as dangerous. We shall see that of all the passions which originate in or are fostered by equality, there is one which it renders peculiarly intense, and which it also infuses into the heart of every man. I mean the love of well-being, The taste for well-being is the prominent and indelible feature of democratic times. It may be believed that a religion which should undertake to destroy so deep-seated a passion would, in the end, be destroyed by it, and if it attempted to wean men entirely from the contemplation of the good things of this world, in order to devote their faculties exclusively to the thought of another, it may be foreseen that the minds of men would at length escape its grasp, to plunge into exclusive enjoyment of present and material pleasures. The chief concern of religion is to purify, to regulate, and to restrain the excessive and exclusive taste for well-being that men feel in periods of equality. But it would be an error to attempt to overcome it completely or to eradicate it. Men cannot be cured of the love of riches, but they may be persuaded to enrich themselves by none but honest means. This brings me to a final consideration, which comprises, as it were, all the others. The more the conditions of men are equalized and assimilated to each other, the more important is it for religion, while it carefully abstains from the daily turmoil of secular affairs, not needlessly to run counter to the ideas that generally prevail, or to the permanent interests that exist in the mass of the people. For as public opinion grows to be more and more the first and most irresistible of existing powers, the religious principle has no external support strong enough to enable it long to resist its attacks. This is no less true of a democratic people ruled by a despot than of a republic. In ages of equality, kings may often command obedience, but the majority always commands belief. To the majority, therefore, deference is to be paid in whatever is not contrary to the faith. I showed in the first part of this work how the American clergy stand aloof from secular affairs. This is the most obvious, but not the only example of their self-restraint. In America, religion is a distinct sphere, in which the priest is sovereign, but out of which he takes care never to go. Within its limits, he is master of the mind. Beyond them, he leaves men to themselves and surrenders them to the independence and instability that belong to their nature and their age. I have seen no country in which Christianity is clothed with fewer forms, figures, and observances than in the United States, or where it presents more distinct, simple, and general notions to the mind. Although the Christians of America are divided into a multitude of sects, they all look upon their religion in the same light. This applies to Roman Catholicism as well as to the other forms of belief. There are no Roman Catholic priests who show less taste for the minute individual observances, for extraordinary or peculiar means of salvation, or who cling more to the spirit and less to the letter of the law than the Roman Catholic priests of the United States. Nowhere is that doctrine of the Church which prohibits the worship reserved to God alone from being offered to the saints more clearly inculcated or more generally followed. Yet the Roman Catholics of America are very submissive and very sincere. Another remark is applicable to the clergy of every communion. The American ministers of the gospel do not attempt to draw or to fix all the thoughts of man upon the life to come. They are willing to surrender a portion of his heart to the cares of the present, seeming to consider the goods of this world as important, though secondary objects. If they take no part themselves in productive labor, they are at least interested in its progress, and they applaud its results. And while they never cease to point to the other world as the great object of the hopes and fears of the believer, They do not forbid him honestly to court prosperity in this. Far from attempting to show that these things are distinct and contrary to one another, they study rather to find out on what point they are most nearly and closely connected. All the American clergy know and respect the intellectual supremacy exercised by the majority. They never sustain any but necessary conflicts with it. They take no share in the altercations of parties, but they readily adopt the general opinions of their country and their age, and they allow themselves to be borne away without opposition in the current of feeling and opinion by which everything around them is carried along. They endeavor to amend their contemporaries, but they do not quit fellowship with them. Public opinion is therefore never hostile to them. It rather supports and protects them, and their belief owes its authority at the same time to the strength which is its own, and to that which it borrows from the opinions of the majority. Thus, it is by respecting all democratic tendencies, not absolutely contrary to herself, and by making use of several of them for her own purposes, religion sustains a successful struggle with that spirit of individual independence which is her most dangerous opponent.